So I was trying to practice beforehand how to pronounce your name. Is it Protozillos? Is that how you pronounce it?
Pretty close, yes. It's
Pretty close.
Protesilaos. But
Protozillos. Okay.
exactly, to avoid this, everybody calls me Prot,
Yeah.
including my relatives and friends. So,
Yeah, I checked and it seems like it's a pretty unique name. Doesn't seem like too many other people have it.
uh, as far as I know, there is nobody. I don't know anybody who has this name. So, yeah, it's a
Is there like a
snowflake
history
name.
behind the name?
So it's a hero of the Trojan War. Well,
Okay.
technically, it's not the name of the person. The person was called something else. And after he died, they gave him this name as an honor for his sacrifice or whatever. Long story short, of course.
So you're honored from birth.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Yeah.
So really quickly, just for the viewers that haven't seen your stuff before, how would you describe yourself? Give us kind of the base points. Who is Prot?
So I am a philosopher. I have studied politics. This is my formal background. I got into Linux in 2016 because I was interested in software freedom. Eventually, tinkering around and playing with tiling window managers, Arch Linux, shell scripts, etc., I found my way to Emacs. And since the summer of 2019, I have been using Emacs basically for all my computing needs. And in the process of more tinkering, I learned how to write Emacs Lisp. I have written, I don't know, 20 packages or something. And now my job is to do coaching on Emacs, Linux, and general life issues. So,
Awesome.
and the final thing is that I live in the mountains of Cyprus after adventures around Europe.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a pretty exciting life. It sounds like you've got quite a lot going on. I noticed that you're like
Yeah.
a very prolific writer. Obviously, you've done.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys have gotten a chance to look at his website, he's got tons of different writings on different philosophy, politics, and all that sort of stuff. Did that kind of? What did you originally get very pulled into like writing so much? Like, obviously, not everybody is as inclined in it as you are.
Sure. It was the year 2011, and at the time I was at the university, and I wanted to publish what I was writing for school, what I was writing for the classes, with some modifications, of course. It wouldn't be the same paper. And I decided to set up a blog, and it was on Blogger at the time, and I kept going from there. I have published over 1,000, I think, something like that. Yeah, I have lost count.
Yeah, it seems like there's quite a lot out there. You seem to have quite a talent for it. Every time I haven't gotten to read too much. I'm one of those people that's I'm too like brain rotted at this point from the internet to read as much as I should, but I try to read more and more.
No, that's good.
But
That's good.
did you? So you ended up getting into Linux and open source just out of like more of a, I guess, like a philosophical interest rather than originally just being interested in tech and stuff?
Correct. When I just to give you some background on this, my
Yeah.
first computer was in 2012. So I got
Wow.
into Linux in 2016. In 2012 is the first time I got, or late 2011, maybe, but
Yeah.
around that time, it was a hand-me-down MacBook. So I didn't even know Alt Tab at the time, and the Control C, Control V. I didn't know that. And basically, I got into Linux because I wanted freedom of software of the software sort, and I also wanted consumer sovereignty. That sort of thing was at the time, because I was seeing the Apple's practices, and I was like, I'm not too much in favor of this. But eventually, I got interested in the technical side as well, so I gained an appreciation of that.
Nice. And so this kind of like all came from kind of an interest in autonomy, I guess, in the end is kind of what you're saying, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. It's twofold though. On the one hand, it is autonomy in the individualistic sense, like I want more freedom for myself, but it also is autonomy / freedom in the collective sense, where I
Yeah.
want to empower others, give back to the community, so that together we feed off of each other's work and thus empower ourselves together.
Nice. Yeah, that's great to hear. I feel like I resonate with a lot of those same ideas. I feel like that's kind of what draws me into the open source side of things as well.
Uh-huh,
Um,
uh-huh.
So obviously you don't really have a background for programming. So what was kind of your first foray into it? I assume it was pre Emacs. I know you did some Vim stuff, but I don't know if you did
Mhm.
much Vim script or anything like that.
It was shell scripts, and
Okay.
really shell scripts without any flow control to them. It was just one line after the other, what I would do interactively in the shell. And little by little, I learned to do if statements, for loops, all of that fancy stuff.
Nice.
And when I
And
was
when I was
using Vim,
I used Vim
I
for
used Vim for 3 years
Emacs.
before Emacs.
I was
But
basically
then,
copy pasting stuff.
while doing
And
that, I
I
discovered
didn't
Emacs, and I
understand
was
anything.
like,
I
didn't
ah,
put any work into the fundamentals and try to configure Vim from a position of knowledge. I was doing it haphazardly, opportunistically. It
Mhm.
worked, but yeah, don't ask me how.
So going from that, you eventually moved to Emacs. I know I like originally when I originally found your stuff, it was like very soon after you had switched to Emacs. I know it was like one of your first videos where you had made talking about moving from Vim to Emacs. I remember you saying that you used Vim without any extensions. Did you ever like try to transition from that copy pasting period to trying to understand Vim, or did Emacs call to you before that point really ever hit?
What happened is that I realized what I was doing with the copy pasting stuff, it was unsustainable because exactly I wasn't building on a foundation of knowledge. So what I did was to cut down on that and reduce it to a minimal config. And I still have it, by the way. It's, I don't know, maybe 100 lines, maybe less, maybe fewer. But then while doing that, I discovered Emacs, and I was like, let's give this a try. But now I will do it the right way, meaning that I will start with solid foundations, read the manual, take it one step at a time, never copy paste. Yeah, basically the opposite.
Nice. Yeah, I did. I also like I think it's very common for Emacs users to all come from Vim. I feel like a lot of people watching can probably relate to that. And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
have like
yeah.
some Vim viewers as well that'll probably relate to some extent of the copy pasting and everything.
Do you get any comments from people who are like, "Hey, I like your Emacs stuff, but I use NeoVim or whatever"? Do you
Yeah,
have
you get that
that?
quite a lot. I made previously I've made a lot of videos relating like focused on Vim and NeoVim. I kind of hit the point of wanting to configure it before like where you ended up moving to Emacs and starting to configure it. I became like a big configuration nerd. I like knew Vim script like it was probably like one of the top 3 languages I knew like front to back.
Wow,
Kind of a
wow.
waste of time in hindsight, but it's fun. It's definitely interesting learning a very quirky language. It's the same with Emacs, really. When you after a little bit of
Yeah,
using Emacs, you realize it's very very quirky.
for sure.
But yeah, it's you do get a lot of people commenting. I'm sure there's a similar thing with you. Lots of people commenting that just
Yeah,
look
yeah,
at it out
yeah.
of interest.
Yeah, yeah, correct, correct.
I see that you like write a lot. You obviously make all these videos showing off Emacs and talking about your political philosophy or just general philosophy. Um, do you find that there's like a particular thing that motivates you to do these things? I know like not everything is motivation based. Sometimes you just kind of tell yourself you got to talk about it. But I was wondering if there's a particular thing that motivates you.
What motivates me in general is to be honest to myself and to try to express what I feel to the extent that I think it is useful for others. Of course, if it's something just private and personal, I won't publicize it. But if it's something where I think that my contribution might help someone, then I will share it. So it is that. It's a combination of honesty and a sense of sharing.
Nice.
But I share not with the intent of pontificating, not with the intent of saying, hey, this is the right
Yeah.
view, but with in the sense of, hey, here is some food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a hard thing to balance. At least I find as well. Like I don't do as much writing where I feel like the writing can be more sharing rather than I feel like videos it's hard to really give like a bunch of information and let people pick what they want. It kind of feels like you're having to like really profess what you're talking about.
Yeah,
But
correct.
it's a hard
Yeah.
thing to balance, especially I know like with your videos are like very informative, which I really like. I think a lot of people in the Emacs, especially like I think in the Emacs community, there's a big pull for that sort of stuff. Like people want to see informative stuff versus Some of my more informative videos that I've made in different topics don't get quite as much pull as the ones focused on Emacs. So there's definitely like a big community
Yeah,
around
yeah.
that, but it's hard not
Yeah,
to.
and I think
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry. Yeah, and I think that in Emacs we kind of have this selection bias, but it's a good bias, which is the people who are drawn into Emacs eventually have this documentation culture and this capacity for more informative, more rich kind of content. So they want to go in depth, basically.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's what I found. That's kind of what drew me into Emacs, because when I moved into Emacs, it was a similar. That was what I liked, was because when like I was saying before, I got very into Vim and I started learning a lot about Vimscript, and I think around the time I was switching to Emacs was right when NeoVim got like Lua, and I started like learning Lua as well.
Hmm.
But like the issue now, NeoVim has like kind of changed this. But at the time, like learning Vimscript and talking about this sort of stuff, like there was a big barrier. There was not a lot of people that when I would start talking about advanced features like how to build your own completion and stuff like that in Vim, like people
Wow.
people are kind of shut off. Or some of my videos like did really well in that, and some of them really did not, where people kind of like didn't really understand like why would I use this built-in feature, for example, like Vim supports something similar to like the compile functionality in
Hmm.
Emacs. It has a
Hmm.
similar thing in Vim. And so when I would try and show that off, people would be like, why would I use that rather than just install another plugin to do it?
Ah,
Versus
yeah,
I
I
find
see. Yeah.
Emacs users are definitely a lot more uh, interested in
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. It's a different culture. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
very different. But I like it. I assume that you do too.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, for sure.
um, And so coming from Vim, there's like a few things that come to my mind, but I was curious, are there things that you find that you miss coming from Vim to Emacs? It's funny because I feel like it's easy to just be like, oh, there's evil, but there's definitely certain things that I personally find that I miss. Are there things that you find that you miss?
When I first started out with Emacs, I was missing the key bindings for sure. It's not just the key bindings though; it's also the language. Vim as a language, the composability and all that. Let's not go into that. But basically, the Vim paradigm of editing. Originally, I thought the Emacs approach was really awkward. The key bindings didn't make much sense, and I had a really tough time. But in the spirit of open-mindedness, I decided to give them a fair chance. And it was like for a month or so. And I went through that awkward phase of, not typing as efficiently as I would like, until it clicked. And I was like, okay, this kind of works. And it is fine. So eventually I didn't miss Vim. I still think that if I was using Vim keys like evil mode for programming, I still think that would be an upgrade over what Emacs provides. But when it comes to prose, I think it's not really an upgrade, because in prose, the way I write, it's basically all insert mode. I am writing from beginning to end, and then I just review it and I publish. So in that regard, I don't miss much, I would say.
Nice. And so the main thing that you use Emacs for, other than writing Emacs Lisp, is prose then, right? That's
Correct, correct. Prose, including my articles and my email correspondence.
okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Personally, I work as like a developer, so I program most of the time, and I also
Hmm.
use the default Emacs settings and stuff like that. I don't really use Evil,
Hmm.
but most of that is a similar thing of trying to be open minded, and it just
Hmm.
more things flow better together. It's not quite as like it's a lot harder to compose things in the same way that you would compose them in Vim. Um, but yeah.
What about structural editing and stuff? Do you do any of that?
Yeah. I guess I say I use
Hmm.
the default. I don't use default. I
Yeah.
guess I use Puni, which is like I don't know if you know of that package.
Hmm.
Basically
Hmm.
a similar idea to like there's a ton of them like Par Edit and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, but yeah, is that what you use as well for programming, or do you use something else?
No, I don't. I haven't tried any of that. I haven't found the courage.
I find it
I
really
used
fun.
I used Edit at some point when I got started, and I was trying to insert a parenthesis, and it was inserting another. And because I didn't know what I was doing, I was inserting parentheses all over the place, and it was making a mess of things. But I guess in the right hands, it's really good. Yeah.
Yeah, I've had I think there's a similar one. I can't remember what it's called. There's one that's kind of like built around the idea of like uh it doesn't work quite the same. It tries to like do all the inserting of parentheses for you rather than like Par Edit kind of like does a similar similar sort of thing. But at least I think I'm thinking of which one. I can't remember which one's
Mm-hmm.
which now. There's Parrot, and then there's the other one. What's the other one called?
There are a few, and I forget the.
Yeah.
So there is a Parroted Smart Parents. There is the other one from Abo, how it's called. Yeah, I don't remember. Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I find it kind of like mixes the two worlds pretty well, especially when it comes to like killing lines. I guess mostly because I program a lot, it probably matters a bit more. It's probably not as big of a deal with prose, but
Yeah.
And so last I checked in, I haven't gotten a lot of chances to watch like videos, so I might be out of date. But last time I looked into it, you were looking into pursuing Clojure for future jobs and everything. Is that still your plan for the future as well?
So there was a phase where I had to relocate. It's kind of a roundabout way of answering this. I had to relocate. I had to change where I lived, and basically I couldn't find any place because the market had changed. The prices were sky high, and I needed a different kind of job to what I was doing, which was manual labor at the time. So I thought I would go into development and that sort of thing. And I looked into Clojure. I was really interested in it, but eventually, because of time constraints, I couldn't pursue it further. The Lisp side I could understand, like the Clojure side I could understand. But then, of course, when you are developing in Clojure, you are not really doing just Clojure. You need to know about the cloud and the infrastructure and this and that and all those neighboring topics, which of course you cannot just learn in a couple of months. So for me, it was basically being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I am interested in it. I am interested in learning it. But now I don't have that pressure to find that kind of job.
Nice. So you're
So
much more
maybe in the
stable now.
future. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you still touch on it every once in a while, just in your spare time, or not really at this point?
I have the book. Which one is it? I forget now the book. No, I have a few books on Clojure, and I want to study them further. But I haven't had the chance to do it. Also, because I am in the process of finalizing the building where I live here. I call it the hut. Because it is kind of a hut. It's not literally a hut, but anyway, it's an incomplete makeshift construction. So that is also taking up too much of my time, and I cannot commit to all those studies.
Yeah, it's hard to balance it all. I find, especially for myself.
Yeah.
So, so this is just kind of a side one that I had here. So I see that in a lot of your videos when you're talking about philosophy and politics, you're walking around outside. Do you consider yourself a pretty active guy? Do you do any extracurricular exercise?
Yeah, I am really active. Like basically half my day, I move, I do stuff. Like my walks are 1.5 hour, 2 hour long walks, and they are uphill. So it's kind of a difficult kind of climb. I really enjoy them. I don't go to the gym, if that's what you mean, and I don't lift weights or anything like that. All the exercise I do comes about organically. It's either a walk or work that I do, manual labor.
Nice. Yeah, exercise is exercise. I just think it's good to have it's nice seeing more people doing things outside in the tech community. I feel like a lot of it's very easy to be insular and just always inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course. You want to balance that. Yeah.
And oh yeah, sorry. So for your interest in philosophy, so what did your interest in philosophy start external from school, or was that mostly when you went into school, your draw to philosophy just kind of became like a major part of your life?
There were hints of my interest in philosophy while at college, while at the university, where I would theorize about various things, abstract away from the particularities of the science, and just go my own way. But it came about on its own later in life after after I graduated from college, and I was working in Brussels at the European Parliament. And then I was more interested in observing the patterns in the phenomena rather than just the phenomena. And so I was theorizing, and then I started getting into philosophy proper, reading other philosophers, the more common names, not necessarily the modern ones.
Mhm.
And eventually I started developing my own thinking on the matter.
Yeah, so you kind of so like what was kind of your cutoff point for when you transitioned between like classical philosophy? I don't know how far you consider. I've like got a pretty decent knowledge of like history of philosophy up till
Mm-hmm.
like semi-modern age, so like end of Roman era. Is that kind of where you stopped, or did you go like fast past
Well,
Roman?
I have read some modern philosophy as well, but I
Okay.
would say that my way of thinking is a blend of the old and the new. Given my technical knowledge, my scientific background, of course, what we have in our world, all the stimuli we are exposed to, as well as my interest in the ancient wisdom, which I find more often than not quite pertinent, ever modern, as it were. Even though it is old and maybe the language sometimes throws you off, but if you focus on the essentials, you will see that the patterns are still here with us.
Do you have any philosophers in particular that you find are more inspirational in a lot of what your thinking revolves around? Is there any particular names that come to mind?
Well, of course, you can say that there are those philosophers who were really prolific and have influenced others, such as Aristotle. But for me, what I find really interesting is Diogenes, the cynic, Diogenes
Hmm.
of Sinope, uh, in large part because of his greater than life kind of personality.
Yeah.
He was a really eccentric figure. And I don't mean to emulate that, but I find it really fascinating how you can philosophize through action, that you can philosophize by your antics, like your antics are your philosophy.
Mhm.
And for me, that's very interesting, not necessarily because I want to do the same things, but
Mhm.
because it shows to me that philosophy is not just about writing academic papers, that sort of thing, and commenting on somebody else's text and so on, but rather that through your actions, your deeds will say what your principles are. So it's kind of an embodied kind of practice.
Yeah, I find with like a lot of the Hellenistic teachings, they all have like that similar sort of idea of like your
Correct.
light virtue and what you're doing in your with your life, rather than maybe like more. I guess it's not really that modern. In my mind, it's modern, like stuff like Hegel, which is a lot less about what you do with your life and more about
The world,
the world. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Correct. Yeah.
Is there a particular? I guess you kind of answered this one already. Is there a particular sort of like branch of philosophy that you're really interested in, like ethics, logic, epistemology? Is there any of them, metaphysics, any of that kind of like draws you in?
I would say, given that I am more interested in the practical side of things, I would say it's ethics. Though, if we frame it this way, I think it is misleading because I don't think you can talk about ethics without an understanding or a concept of metaphysics, for example, or with some notion of epistemology. So I think fundamentally you have to have a bit of everything, even if you are more emphasizing one of the facets. But you
Yeah.
cannot really be, a specialist in the narrowest sense.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think there's like a pretty famous quote from like Epictetus where he says like if like a student saying that logic is useless, and then he says, well, like how can you argue that logic is useless without using logic? You
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
can't throw away the other schools. Um,
correct.
do you think more people should pursue philosophy um, on a
Mhm.
general level? Like, what level do you think people should pursue it? Because obviously, people like just
Yeah,
thinking
yeah,
to some extent is philosophy, but where do you think people should go to the extent with it?
yeah. Let's frame this a bit differently because there
Yeah.
is also this idea that philosophy is kind of useless. Like, what do you use it for?
Hmm.
And because you mentioned logic a bit earlier, think about it with somebody exercising. We mentioned the activities earlier. So somebody is there doing their routines and they are exercising. And then you're like, hey, what does this weightlifting do? It's useless, right?
Mhm.
And if you focus on the activity itself, it is indeed useless. You are just lifting the weight. What are you doing? But the upside of it is that it strengthens you, and then you can do other stuff with that strength. And I think the same is true for philosophy. Like, philosophy in itself may not be practical, you are not doing stuff with it.
Mhm.
But because you are thinking through the things, thinking through the topics, through the experiences, you are reflecting on your own state of mind, on the state of the world that's at large. Then, when it comes to the practical things you are doing, you are able to have a bigger picture sense of what you are doing. And this gives you more clarity, and you can be more deliberate and more accurate. So I would say some training in philosophy is good. Of course, you don't want to overdo it. In the same way, you don't want to overdo it with the gym, right? You have a life as well.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I think there's a point where you go too far in and you start to like uh, lose context or become out of touch almost.
Correct, correct. And I think this is a trap in philosophy where you can be philosophizing for the sake of philosophy and it being self-referential, and then you forget about what is happening all around you.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, you really want to anchor yourself in, the everyday experience.
Do you find that you end up getting pulled into the academic world at all, or do you like when it comes to philosophy, or like you said that you're more historically oriented, so I guess that's not quite as much of a thing that you face.
No, no, correct, correct. I am not drawn into the academic discourse, not because I am against it. Of course, we need it, but because it doesn't appeal to me in particular.
Nice. Yeah, that sounds like that would probably be the case. And so,
Yeah, yeah.
just for context, when you say that you're in school and your background in school was like politically oriented, what was like the name of your degree or what you took? Just so that way
It's
people have more context.
European politics, economics, and law.
Okay.
So basically, I was specializing in the European integration process, the European Union,
Hmm.
and is why I went to work at the European Parliament afterwards.
That makes a lot of sense now. From not that I've gotten to read a lot of your stuff, but a lot of the
Uh-huh.
stuff that I've read has had to do with the European Union, so that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Are there any like political or philosophical books or readings that you recommend to a lot of the viewers or to people that you reach out to usually?
Oh, there are a lot, and I think that I will forget at least half of them now. But the general approach is that you don't want to just read politics. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you want to read history, you want to read economics, you want to have a rounded understanding of things because, of course, when you go to college, everything is compartmentalized. You go and you study economics and just economics, or political science and only that, right? But in the real world, we have a continuum. You don't just have the economy on one side and the politics on the other side. They are blending into a singular reality. So, of course, to understand what is happening around us, we have to have a sense of everything. We have to be interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I find that's something that I find is like very not quite as like cultural, but I find that it depends a lot on like how your country's school system works. Like even just in
Mm.
Canada here, we have like different provinces do different. For example, like in my province that I'm originally from, Alberta, we only have social studies, which is basically English,
Oh.
history. I wouldn't really call it economics, but kind of economics, where you talk about like Keynesianism and stuff like very,
Okay.
very surface level stuff that you would kind of just learn in like the first lecture of economics or something like that.
Uh-huh.
And so you cover all of it in one class where it like becomes one thing, which has the pro of what you were saying, where it all feels very interconnected, but you also don't learn each of the things very deeply. And so you end up having a very
Yeah.
narrow scope of knowledge. It's very difficult to balance all of that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's hard. Yeah, of course, you want to go in depth as well. You want to have some kind of deep understanding into at least one or a couple of disciplines. But yeah, of course, you cannot learn everything.
Yeah. Do you find that did you grow up originally in Cyprus or
No, no, I was born and raised in Greece.
okay?
And I
Um,
lived there for until my 18th year, and then I came to Cyprus, studied here, went to Belgium, and around a few other countries, and then I came back to Cyprus, to the mountains.
What drew you back to Cyprus then?
I wanted to disconnect from the busy life and the rhythms of where I was, of Brussels. And I wanted something radically different. And I came to Cyprus because I liked it here during my studies.
Mhm.
And I was like, okay, I will go to the mountains. I want to be away from the busy city life, the busy political life. And so it's where I ended up.
Nice. Do you find that do you feel like more people could get more out of stepping away from busy cities? Are you kind of like, do you have that sort of um I don't really quite know what like the same idea would be, more of a decentralized idea of like how people should function, or are you more, just do whatever works?
Of course, you can frame it in political terms, like you would have communities and it would be
Mm-hmm.
good for the environment or whatever. You can frame it along those lines as well. And that's a very interesting discussion. But here I want to focus on the individual. And it's like when you are conditioned to a certain pace of life, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the fast paced life of the city, you cannot appreciate the little things. You cannot appreciate the subtlety in life. And you can imagine this as an analogy. If you are driving your car and are speeding down the highway, you don't really get to see anything, right? Everything
Mm-hmm.
disappears. But if you slow down, then you pay attention. Oh, look at the color of the leaves. Oh, look at this, look at that. Oh, there is a squirrel there, and so on and so forth. And that's how it is when you purposefully, when you deliberately slow down your own experience. And even if you do it only for a little while, just to gain a grip on your understanding of what is happening, I think that is good. Of course, if you can do it for a prolonged time, I think that's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
At
think
least for
there's
me, it basically remade me.
yeah, I think there's a lot of value in that. I think getting a chance to be disconnected for a while. I've done like a few things similar to that
Hmm.
where I've
Hmm.
spent months kind of basically disconnected, no internet or anything like that. When I
Ah,
was
sounds
younger,
good.
not so much now, unfortunately. Work does not allow for that too easily.
Yeah, 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 of course.
But so do you find that you kind of align? Not that like I don't know. I feel like political ideologies now is kind of like a very big, like people take them very seriously, versus I feel like they're in reality, I don't think too many of them should be taken as seriously as being like, if somebody believes
Hmm.
something, you shouldn't associate everything along with that ideology with the person. But do you find that
Correct.
you align yourself with like a particular political ideology, or maybe just a position on like the political compass?
Hmm.
um
Broadly speaking, I am a leftist. Broadly speaking, but again, to your point, this is easy to mislabel
yeah,
yourself
means so many things really.
and be misunderstood. Yeah, but generally, I am a leftist, but I am also of the libertarian sort.
Mm,
So that's not the kind of the big bugaboo kind of huge state that, yeah,
yeah, like an
So
anarcho sort of thing.
yeah, it's more of an anarchic sort. But I understand that anarchy per se may not be viable, so
Yeah.
we have to be flexible. But you can still retain a kernel of that. You can still have smaller communities, and it can still be based on solidarity. And then there are other values as well for the environment all around us, the other forms of life all around us. So not just for people, as well as for people, of course. We want to care for each other.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
I
this
feel.
is my broad standing. But yeah, just to be clear that when you say left, people will identify you with somebody they know, and now
Mhm.
whatever they say, you say, which is not the case, right?
Yeah. No, yeah, I feel like everyone can
Yeah.
relate to that idea. Yeah, it's just a difference in where you align with a lot of people, but you may not feel the same way that they do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah.
exactly. But I think here, just to comment on this, what we are kind of missing, generally speaking, at least in the mainstream
Mhm.
discussion, is a sense of reasonableness. We don't have common sense. Like we see the other side, whatever the other side is, as the evil incarnate. So
Yeah.
everything they say is wrong and everything we say is correct. Whereas I think in practice, there is always common ground. And I make mistakes, everybody makes mistakes, and we want to arrive at some kind of a consensus that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. I think there's a lot. Like, I think everybody is. I feel like this topic kind of comes up quite a bit of like this idea of like an echo chamber, where
Mm-hmm.
people get very locked into one way of thinking and aren't willing to like. Because even if maybe somebody has the same idea as you, but you think of them as like you were saying, like you think of them as like the left or the right. Their
Yeah.
idea, even if you probably would agree with it if you really thought about it, you're throwing it out the window. And that's like
Mm-hmm.
at least I don't know what it's like, what the political climate is like in Cyprus, but at least in Canada, the parties are very like they're a lot less focused on policies and more focused on like downplaying the other side, which doesn't
Yeah,
really help
yeah, yeah.
anybody. Nobody gains anything from hating on some other group. You gain a lot more from actually action.
Correct, correct. And it's kind of turning it into a sport fandom kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, in Europe, we have football, so I would say it's the footballization of politics, like.
Mm-hmm.
And you are team blue, team red, and we can never agree on anything.
Yeah.
So in Cyprus, it is a bit like that as well, though not to the extent that we see in the news in other countries, such as in America, for example,
Yeah.
the
It's the
USA.
same thing. Yeah. We're not
Yes,
as extreme as in America.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Do you find so like you're very obviously you try to be pragmatic, it sounds like, when it comes to your different views of things. So do you if you were like put in this is kind of like a really uh this is not practical. Right after saying that, I see that you're a very practical person. But if you were put in a position of power, do you think
Mhm.
that you would move if you were given the opportunity? Do you think you'd probably try to move things more to um, like is there a particular I'm trying to think of like the proper word, like governing policy
Mhm.
that you think you'd try to move towards? Because obviously some people maybe would consider themselves on the left would be like, oh, full blown authoritarian communism is exactly where I'd go. Obviously, it doesn't sound like that would be your perspective, but
No, no, yeah.
what would you, if you were given no holds bar, full control of things, what do you think
As
would be different?
I would be practical in the sense of not trying to be totalistic in the implementation of my ideology. I would focus on trying to improve the lives of those who need it the most and try to fix practical things in life when it comes to the purchasing power, when it comes to the rate of rent, the cost of property, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be happy to do it at the expense of ideological purity, if it
Mm-hmm.
would get me there, right? So I would be happy to do that.
Yeah.
Because I think like what happens with politicians who try to propose some kind of a reform agenda,
Mm-hmm.
they focus too much on the ideological purity because, of course, is what draws voters to them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you only have that purity, you will never get to govern. And if you never get to govern, well, who wins in the end? The other side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's you see that all the time in it's the same thing as what we were saying before with in America people can be more extreme, but it's interesting because the more extreme parties that stand out are obviously, unless they're one of the big two in America, and I think that's common in most places that use the same voting system, uh, don't seem to get quite as much support as you would expect, considering that people might sound more extreme, but really people don't actually it's questionable whether or not that pulls people to the polls on
Yeah,
that
yeah,
side
yeah,
of
yeah.
things.
So there is that. There is that. Of course, it depends on the electoral system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Like the two-party system in the USA, of course, makes it so that your votes go to waste, basically.
Yeah.
But in other countries where you have a pluralist, a multi-party system, there people will go to vote, and these smaller parties can get into power or can get at least into parliament.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the thing is like, how do you go to the next step of actually implementing reforms, not just
Mm-hmm.
advocating for reforms?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty tough one to see. It's hard to see. You see a lot of like talk, but not as much action on a lot of the ideas. And
Yeah,
sometimes what maybe the leader of a party or the vocal, the person that's speaking in the party might not actually be able to get everybody in the party and be able to get things passed in parliament, or maybe. So like, for example,
correct.
like over here, we have a lot of talk about, like, I don't know what it's like there, but in Canada we have a really bad housing crisis. Our
Hmm.
like housing prices are like basically double what they are in America. Um,
Wow.
so it's like a really major issue, and there's a lot of talk about solving these problems, but it's like hard to see policies that are actually going to solve it. Like saying like building houses isn't really going to give somebody a house very soon. Sort of stuff like that. So.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, part of this is not just people trying to cling on to their ideology. It's also that these are complex issues, right? So there is not a really an easy solution to this sort of crisis.
Mhm.
Like because you might say, okay, let's put a ceiling on prices, and
Mhm.
let's try something like that. But then you have to consider what are the knock-on effects of that kind of policy. So you
Mhm.
really have to have a holistic agenda, and that is what makes it difficult. So I can understand why there isn't much action as well, not
Yeah.
to justify certain patterns of behavior, but just to say that things are complex as well, and we don't want to give the impression that, oh, politicians, they just talk, and
Yeah.
it's the easiest job in the world.
Mhm.
Of course, some do that, but it's also that the issues are kind of hard.
Yeah, it is housing. There's a lot of issues other than housing, I'm sure. I'm
Yeah,
not sure what the situation is like over there, but yeah. So for us, it is
yeah,
definitely, it's not an easy thing to solve. Housing is not an easy one, and there's a lot of difficulty.
yeah,
Obviously, like world economy and everything is also a tough thing to balance, especially when we were just talking about like if you try to be too dogmatic or ideological in your choices, it can have really detrimental impacts on your economy, even in a way that you're not really expecting. Like you could have like
exactly.
people who completely disagree with you having like, causing trade tariffs or something like that. That's obviously sounds extreme, but obviously like history has shown that that happens pretty
Oh, for sure,
regularly.
for sure, for sure, for sure. Yes, yes. For sure,
Um,
that can happen. And if you have a global embargo on you, then who gains in the end? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, do you think everybody should be involved in politics? Do you think everybody owes it to themselves to learn about politics?
To learn, at least, yes. I think yes, because we kind of take for granted what we have in this world, what previous generations achieved through struggles. And if you read history, these struggles were not peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
So they were bloody struggles, and it was really hard. And I think we take it for granted what we have today, and we complain that how imperfect it is, but we don't realize how much worse it could get, and like really ugly.
Yeah.
And I think the only way to avert that kind of scenario is by being more involved, being more informed. And to the point of the echo chamber you mentioned earlier, trying to break that bubble, trying to escape from that chamber, and trying to see the other side as a side that consists of people who have reason as well as you do, and maybe they are not completely evil or completely beguiled by some fallacy or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to come to that common sense again, and see the other person as a human, and see that we are sharing the same society, the same legal order. And if I don't care and you don't care and nobody cares, well, guess what? Those who are the most corrupt and sociopathic will care, and then you won't like it.
Yeah. I think I couldn't agree more. I think it's very good for people to be at least know how their political system works in their country and know the people involved and hear the other or the other side. Sometimes the other side isn't so
Yeah,
different from what you're expecting.
Correct, correct. And you get this not just in theory. Of course, you can arrive at that conclusion intellectually, but also if you try to get involved in local affairs, like really the neighborhood kind of thing, up to the mayor kind of level, where you have to talk to your neighbor about practical stuff like, collecting garbage or keeping the roads clean and the pavement safe, and how
Mm-hmm.
do we deal with the pets and all that sort of stuff. Like when you talk to people about practical stuff like this, there is no place for these kind of grand ideologies and these reform agendas. You really have to focus on the basics, and then you talk to someone who is right next to you, and
Definitely.
there I think reason prevails.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's really important. Even just like I find for myself when I have realized that I start to have like very specific ideas in my mind, I try to like journal a bit and write about it and kind of talk to yourself sort of thing. Sometimes you
Hmm.
realize like, oh, this extreme idea that I had is kind of, there's a limit where it starts to kind of break down, and obviously this isn't maybe not extreme, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah. I know for
you
sure.
have a
Yeah, but
idea that it's a
this
binary, but
self
binary isn't best. Sorry, go ahead.
Correct, correct. This self-reflection that you do, I think, is quite fruitful because it gives you the opportunity to distance yourself from the idea and to consider it dispassionately.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that allows you to appraise it more accurately.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I find that helps quite a lot. Do you do a similar thing yourself or anything like that? Or you mostly just try and get out involved and talk to the community around you? I guess you said that you're not quite in like the most busy city. So,
No. I live where I live. There are no neighbors at all, so the neighborhood politics are already out of the window. But there is a village nearby, and when I get the chance to talk with people there, I always try to be constructive and listen to what they say and share my views and that sort of thing. But I don't pretend to be the savior or the messiah kind of thing. And here are the policies, and this is what you
mm-hmm.
should do. So I approach this also with a sense of curiosity, a sense of understanding what their concerns are,
Mm-hmm.
and then reflecting on what my thoughts are and what is kind of the midpoint between those two positions.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's awesome
Hmm.
that you like obviously when you're separated from like a major city, obviously you don't get those small community interactions quite the same way. But uh, yeah.
Yeah.
So just so do you consider yourself much of like an activist at all? Like, is there, for example, I don't know, I guess I'm not quite sure what it would be, I guess, in your situation. Like, for example, a lot of people here join different protests or different marches for different things. Do you find that you're an activist in that, or maybe in like they'll join community councils to advocate for different things, for example, environmental action or something like that?
Because I live in a remote place now, I cannot be an activist in practice. But when I lived in cities, I would volunteer for various causes, and I was mostly interested in that kind of constructive, getting things done kind of approach to changing lives, rather than protesting. I've never participated in a protest.
Yeah.
Maybe because I wasn't there, so it's not like I was against them, but it just never happened. But I volunteered many times for all sorts of things.
Mm. Um. Cool. Yeah, that was just I was just curious on that one. That was just one of my other
Uh-huh,
things.
uh-huh.
For sorry, now I'm at some of these questions that I had written out were purely for my own selfish interests of hearing someone
No
else's
worries, no
opinion on
worries.
things. So so I was kind of curious as to what your thoughts are. I don't know if you've heard about some of these ideas, like accelerationism or I don't know what they actually call it, but it's basically like based on, I don't know if you've ever heard of like systems theory, where it's basically like this idea that the system becomes too complex, that things don't really change. So a good example of this, I don't know if any of this like aligns, you can go ahead and interrupt me.
Mm-hmm.
But for the systems theory thing, it's basically like versus all these revolutions that happened in history, the systems were so simple because there was basically a monarch you had to overthrow in a lot of cases. And so the requirements to do that were very simple. If you could militarize a small community, you could cause a revolution. Versus now, the systems are very complex. There's a whole parliament. There's independent leaders for each country. You can't just take that person, remove them from the leadership, and put someone else in and solve the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Without, I don't know. In a lot of cases, I guess this still happens, but it's usually via some sort of military coup, which I don't know. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really lead
Mm-hmm.
to like much action in a lot of cases, it seems. So the idea for like this other theory was basically an anarcho-monarchism is kind of like what you can think of it as, where basically some rich dude like Elon Musk buys land in some country and basically makes his own state there. And
Mm-hmm.
then I don't know if you've heard about like accelerationism is a lot more straightforward, which I feel like you might have heard of probably already.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. No, I haven't
Um,
heard the term, but is it along those
okay.
lines?
It's an alternative approach. So that's one approach is kind of like this idea for that was one idea for like how to if you can't cause change, we make change somewhere else is kind of the idea. Accelerationism,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of different ways. You'll see like if you've ever used like X, I guess it is now, like a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
like tech people will put something/ac on their bio. And basically the idea of accelerationism is you accelerate something until its eventual collapse or some big change. So, for example, people call
Oh.
themselves like right accelerationists, where you want to accelerate the right side of things, like accelerate capitalism to the point where technology has
Mm-hmm.
advanced, put more power into people like Jeff Bezos to control things. Or left accelerationism would be, for example, accelerate technology to the point where nobody needs to work anymore and we reach like more of a utopian idea.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was kind of curious. I guess what I was curious about was if you had heard of these ideas before and if you had any thoughts on them.
I haven't heard, so these
Okay.
are just some preliminary thoughts.
Yeah.
What would be the goal? Like accelerate with the intent of eventually leading to its implosion, or with the intent of leading to its perfection?
Yeah. So for example, if you accelerationism is usually it's either acceleration to the point that it fails or acceleration to the
Mhm.
point that it's beyond a point where it can change anymore. Like it's too good. So for example, like
Okay, okay.
people who are like really into like they call it UAC, like unconditional accelerationism, where like people want like how there's people against the development of AI versus people that want unlimited control for developing AI sort of thing. That would be an
Mm-hmm.
example of
Mm-hmm.
unconditional acceleration or efficient
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
acceleration. Yeah, efficient
Uh-huh.
accelerationism. I don't know
Yeah,
if that
it's
answers your question.
yeah. It answers it. Thank you. Well, it's an interesting concept, though it is counterfactual. Not counterfactual, but counterintuitive, because you cannot predict how it will go. Of course, in theory, you may say that let's perfect it, or let's accelerate it to the point of perfection or to the point of implosion. But what if that doesn't happen? What if it is in an intermediate state where it kind of works, kind of doesn't work, and while you are trying to accelerate in one direction, there are kind of counter forces to it, and you reach the state where it's really dystopic, and you are like, okay, let's push it a bit further, and it will collapse, but you cannot actually do that final push.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's kind of a thing that I've heard come up quite a bit. I think it's a pretty common sentiment on the idea where, for example, like both like right and left acceleration, or more so like the capitalist idea of accelerationism. Like I don't know if you've ever read any of Marx's
Mm-hmm,
writings, but
mm-hmm.
he talks a bit about
Yeah.
capitalism bound to failure because of
Yeah.
kind of this idea that it will eventually collapse, and that's kind of like where like left accelerationism. If people are watching the video and they have a different idea of it, then feel free to comment down below because I'm not super informed on it because obviously there's a certain amount of like I just find it interesting as an idea. But
It's
yeah,
an
both
interesting
lead to the
idea.
same thing and they can go completely different directions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and in many leftist intellectuals, especially of the Marxist tradition, you will find this late stage capitalism and these sorts of expressions. Yeah, for sure.
yeah,
But again, it's back to what I said earlier. What if you cannot make that final push? What if there isn't a perfect state or a state that is untenable? and it's a state of disorderly integration,
Mm-hmm.
rather disintegration, I mean. And you are in this state that is dystopic enough for you to hate it, but not to the point where it can be destroyed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty fair response. Do you have any thoughts? The one that I found really interesting, because I think the accelerationism idea is kind of limited in the fact that, like, you know, you can't really, a lot of these ideas, you can't really accelerate them much more than they are right now. I think there's a lot of
Hmm.
power being held in different people's hands that, like, if they could accelerate things, if they could make things happen faster, I'm sure they would.
Yeah,
Um,
you also have to consider the world. Like, let's say that we accelerate in the USA and we succeed, and whatever that means, right? We
mhm,
succeed in accelerating there, but we don't control what happens in other countries. And what if the other countries now are empowered to exploit this accelerated state that the USA is in?
mhm.
Whatever that means. I don't mean to entertain theories, but
Yeah.
I mean to say that unless you control all the countries, basically this scheme has loopholes and it can be exploited.
Yeah, I think it's definitely it's an interesting thought experiment, but yeah, like you're saying, there's it's hard to really have some sort of an ideology of what will happen in the end.
Hmm. Hmm.
And another one that the other one that I was talking about that I can't quite remember the term that they use, but the idea is kind of like an anarcho monarchism, where it's basically the idea is that, like, for example, like I said before, like someone very rich like Jeff Bezos or something
Hmm.
decides to buy a plot of land, and basically, because, for example, he wants to do some sort of accelerationist idea, and he's limited by some sort of political uh, regulation, and he decides to make his own, like, sort of state or a nation
Hmm.
state
Hmm.
basically. And so the idea of where this eventually goes that I've heard before is basically, I can't remember the name of the person or the name of what they called this, so take it with a grain of salt.
Uh-huh,
But
uh-huh.
the idea is that basically, as that happens, more and more people will do it, and just like technology and everything, it trickles down, and then
Hmm.
eventually, smaller and smaller groups can have their own little ideological nation state. So, for example, you could have a little state that's kind of like basically stateless, no leadership, and it's communally owned. But you could also have, say, for example, like a fascist nation state right next door.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
do you have any thoughts on
Yeah.
or interest in that idea?
Yeah, well, this is like the paradox of the anarchic world, right? Where you could have all these different communities next to each other, but what happens if the fascist neighbor micronation has an expansionist agenda?
Yeah.
Like, what do you do? Do you now have conscription? Do you have a standing army? How do you respond to that? Do you have a military industry? Do you have, so you will get into all these practical issues, and then basically you go down the rabbit hole of the military industrial complex, and now we need to ramp up production to basically preserve our freedom. But in
Yeah.
preserving our freedom, we have become something else in the process.
Yeah, it's an interesting. That's like another. When I've heard this before, that was a similar idea that I had also heard. It was, which is like something that comes to your mind. You think of all these different groups. Somebody's going to want more land, and it's going to be way easier to take over this tiny little nation state than any pre-existing legitimate country. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah. It's, and then there will be other practical issues like okay, let's say we have this anarcho-monarchic setup. Um, how do we form the laws? Like, is it only up to the, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos to promulgate laws? And what do we do if we don't like them?
yeah, the idea that I've heard for how it would work is like they would say, it's funny because this is all purely theory. So
Of course, of course, of
but
course.
the idea is that basically I would say I have all this money, I'm going to buy this land in some like third world country or something like that, or some, I don't know, some government was willing to give me land that I could do whatever I want with. And then I would basically say, this is the land that I own. You guys can all come there. This is the Constitution. And then if you agree with the Constitution, that would kind of decide things. Then from there, I guess that would kind of determine your laws, which would kind of depend on, yeah,
Mm,
basically, if the Constitution was basically, oh, this is a totalitarian state, which I don't think a lot of people would really be in on and want to go to, but it could be something like that, or it could be the idea of like a similar thing in most countries with a parliament and some sort of prime minister or president. But yeah, or you could have more of like a commune like system, which I think is, at least for people who are very like align with some of what you've said, would be like very interested in. But obviously that's a harder point to reach versus having some rich person buy the land. And because, I don't know, it's hard to get a community to own land when everybody has to pitch in on it, and not everybody's going to agree.
Of course. But a scheme that I have seen people do is pool resources. Of course, this idea of some rich guy buying land is one option. But what I have seen is like people pool resources and then buy a plot of land and they build like 4 houses in that. And now they have their little village, in quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And then they regulate their own affairs. Of course, they still are, kind of in a state. They are not their own micronation, but they kind of regulate their own neighborhood, and they decide what they do with their children, if they have children, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever? Sorry, now I'm kind of going off topic again. But have you ever learned about like the Zapatistas in Mexico?
I've heard them, but I don't know much about them.
Okay.
So they were guerrillas, I think.
Yeah. So you can go on with
I
what
don't
like
know much.
you. Okay. So basically, the idea is that basically they were advocating for the native people of Mexico in like different areas. I'm also not an expert, but this is my understanding of it. And so basically, they become basically a sort of guerrilla militia sort of idea against the Mexican government, requesting basically a bunch of different land to be returned back to people, because basically when NAFTA was created, which is like the North American trade, I think that's what it's for. Yeah.
Association.
Yeah. When that happened, they removed like certain things from the Mexican Constitution, is my understanding, which basically gave up this communal land, which was kind of the start of this whole thing. But basically, the main reason I was bringing it up was because eventually the Mexican government allowed them to have this specific part in, I can't remember the name of it, some part of Mexico, which is basically governed by them. And they don't call it, it's not like they don't call it like, they don't align themselves with an ideology, but it is very like anarcho-socialist sort of idea where it's very like communal, more of like a commune idea, but everything is shared. And it sounds like it's like worked out pretty well. It sounds like there's been a lot of like attempts by the Mexican government to kind of shut it down that haven't gone through, because they've been able to maintain like a semblance of like a semi-standing army. I find it very interesting. Anyways, if you find that sort of stuff interesting, it would definitely be worth looking.
That's fair. Yeah, for sure. But I guess they are also bound by a sense of community, because it's not an ideological community or a club, if you like. But it's kind of an organic community in the sense that they are kind of a clan, kind of a tribe, kind of the indigenous people there. So I guess they have a culture of their own, and they have lots of things binding them together.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely the one thing that kind of separates it from a lot of the existing ones. I think it's difficult to get to that point without having some sort of an existing connection to people.
Yeah, because if you do it just on the basis of if we agree on a certain ideology, you have a club, and you have to consider how societies develop over time, and whether this homogeneity will be preserved long term from one generation to the other, and how that works. So, of course, if you can make that work, then you have a community in the sense of a tribe. But otherwise, you cannot sustain it as a club of like-minded intellectuals.
Definitely. Okay, so we'll move on to our last few topics here. So the first one, so my second last question was basically, what do you think is your next action? Like, where do you think you stand in what you're future is as a person? I don't know if you'd call yourself like as a philosopher. Do you feel like your main goal now is to kind of share your ideas with other people, or where do you think, what is your end goal, I guess, right now?
So I don't work on the basis of end goals. I
Okay.
work on the basis of going with the flow and letting life lead the way. You know, things happen and I just react to them. My immediate priority is to fix the hut here, make it a perfectly habitable place. It's still a work in progress, not to go into that.
Mm-hmm.
So I still have a lot to do here because this provides me shelter. So I want to have this basic safety. And after that, I just want to keep doing what I do, write, talk, that sort of thing, and wherever it leads me. And I enjoy this kind of spontaneity and this kind of discovery that comes with it.
Nice. And are there any, my last question was, are there any
Mhm.
projects that you'd like to share that maybe you haven't gotten a chance to share elsewhere, or maybe anything that people that are watching this might be interested in that you're working on?
So of course there are things that I am doing around the hut, and maybe I will show them at some point. And then there are ideas I have for Emacs packages, and then basically more on the topics I cover, and that would be it. So nothing fancy,
Awesome.
nothing hugely eventful.
Well, it's still plenty of other things. More Emacs packages from you are always welcome.
Thank you, thank you.
And then I think I'll go ahead. Let me just make sure that
Uh,
the recording's all good. Okay. Um, yeah. And then is there any final closing words that you'd like to have in the recording?
Thank you very much for this chat. I learned a lot. I had a good time. And the thing is, because we also started with the Emacs theme,
Mhm.
the thing is that going from Emacs to politics, you might see, okay, but what is the connection between those? And I think the connection is that you always have to have a sense of understanding what it is you are interacting with. In the case of Emacs, it is your computer, the interface to your computer. But then in the case of politics, it's your immediate milieu, your environment. And in both
Mhm.
cases, we want to understand what is happening.
Awesome. Yeah, it was great having you on. Really insightful ideas. It was really great to uh, get some opportunities to talk about some things that I haven't seen in some of your other interviews. And hopefully, some of the people on the channel will go and check out some of your other works and some of your great thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.